Hello again. There have been some really good discussion posts on the first week with the articles about America as a Christian nation. And I think you've probably seen that this is really a challenging question, a challenging issue. Um, and it'll kind of keep coming up. This week we'll start to move towards what is it that Bloom means when he talks about post-Christian? Because like I said at the beginning of last week, if it's post-Christian now, then that would mean it was Christian at some point. But Bloom has a very specific meaning to that. Now, before we move into that, I would like to say that I think part of the challenge that we're seeing in our discussion, I think I would root the challenge to giving some kind of clear definition as to whether or not America is Christian, has a sort of historical context and setting. Its historical roots are in the Enlightenment. And this is because there's a philosopher, Christian Smith, who's author of a book, Moral Believing Animals. And in that book, he says, and I think he's right, but he says, the Enlightenment itself was in good measure a re-narration of Christianity in secular terms. It was often an effort to maintain Christian values apart from Christian spirituality. So what he's getting at there is like, you have your kind of Thomas Jefferson moments where he takes the miracles out of the Bible, but he wants to kind of elucidate the teachings of Jesus as these positive things, but he doesn't want the miracles. Adam Smith was, not Adam Smith, boy, John Adams, wow. John Adams was adamantly not in favor of the sort of very spiritual, mystical elements of Christianity. Though his wife was a very devout Christian, his son John Quincy Adams was a very devout Christian, he leaned towards a sort of deism. Not that he totally disbelieved in God answering prayers, but he didn't like this whole aspect of kind of Jesus dying on the cross, his blood cleansing us of sin. Adams didn't much care for that. George Washington's a rather enigmatic figure in this sense. There's some good books. One called The Faiths, plural, Faith of Our Fathers, which is an interesting look at some of the key founding fathers in their relation to kind of an Orthodox Christianity. But nonetheless, there is some sense in which they're all products of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment does oftentimes just accept sort of Christian values and ideas on some level while trying to reject the mystical, theological, dogmatic aspects of Christianity. And this is true of everybody from your very devoted Christians in the most orthodox sense, down to, in some degree, even your one that would be closest to an atheist, your Thomas Paine or your Benjamin Franklin. They on some level accept Enlightenment ideals that many of you have noted in the discussion board have their roots in some offshoot of a sort of Christian, Judeo-Christian moral concepts and philosophical concepts. I think that would play into, on some level, what Bloom is looking at when he calls America now a post-Christian nation. But there's something else he's looking at too, and he talks about America as having a very Gnostic religious mood. You're going to see that this week as you begin reading the text. What do we mean by Gnostic? Now you're going to have to give him room to define it in his own way, and in my concluding lecture I'll give you some points that I think are challenges and critiques of what he says, though on some level I agree with his Gnostic kind of prognosis that American religion is very Gnostic. What do we mean by Gnostic? Well, at the most basic level, and there's a short Wikipedia link, I know a lot of times we say don't use Wikipedia. What I usually mean by that is don't stop at Wikipedia. It's often a good place. It's an encyclopedia. It's a good place to start. And This isn't a class on Gnosticism, so you don't have to delve deep, but I do have a link to a Gnosticism article from Wikipedia that you should read, as well as on Orphism, because Bloom talks about Orphism as well, though not to the degree that he brings in Gnosticism. But essentially, Gnosticism, the word gnosis has to do with knowledge. And Gnosticism was a religious development in the Greco-Roman world that affected and was affected by and affected Greek philosophy, Greek religion, mystery cults, as well as certain aspects of Judaism at the time. And early Christianity, you see these debates between more essentially traditionally Jewish-rooted Christianity and a Gnostic Christianity. And so when we see Paul in some of his letters talking about a physical resurrection of the body, he's contending against Gnosticism. When we see in John's letter in 1 John, it starts out, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have heard with our ears, what we have touched with our hands. Is very physical bodily language, has a certain Jewish appreciation for creation. God, the good God, created everything, and he created it originally good, and it was broken by disobedience, but it's not evil in and of itself. Gnosticism has a different root. Gnosticism says, no, stuff is just bad. In fact, it has this belief in a demiurge. It's a lower god. So in Gnosticism, there are these levels of gods, and the demiurge was unwise, was foolish, was silly. He created stuff, and he should have known better, but didn't. And this stuff traps souls into bodies. And so the ultimate good is for the soul to be released of the body. And the way that happens is through kind of possession of a secret knowledge. There's a certain element of ancient religious, Egyptian religion in this. In ancient Egypt, there was this idea that you could purchase certain knowledge to take with you into the afterlife, and if you had the right spells and the right incantations, you could pass the tests that you needed to pass. So that knowledge, if your life had to be weighed in a balance against the feather, and if your life was too heavy, you would be cast out, wouldn't be received into the good afterlife. But there were ways to kind of overcome your mistakes, your errors, your sins, by buying, these incantations, this secret knowledge on scrolls, which, obviously that works out better for the wealthy than for the poor. That aspect of Gnosticism, I would argue, has a certain American connection to it, and we'll talk about that later too when we get into a discussion of the prosperity doctrine in America. But that said, the elements of Gnosticism that Bloom is going to want to focus on is not so much the stuff bad, spirit good, or the idea of the demiurge, though I think a little bit problematically, which I'll discuss a little bit in my concluding lecture. He talks about American Gnosticism as a worship of the demiurge. He may be right. We can think about that in the discussion board. But the big parts of kind of American religion that are the elements that are really Gnostic are this focus on kind of a self-realization through knowledge, an absolute knowledge, as opposed to kind of faith. At one point the Bible talks about faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Gnosticism is not so interested in that. It wants absolute certain knowledge that if I know these facts, then I'm good to go. It's a certain self-assertiveness, a self-realization, an arrival at the true self, the spiritual self, through secret knowledge. And that aspect of Gnosticism, I would argue with Bloom. I think Bloom is hitting on something when he says that's a very real aspect of American religion, be it Christian, Jewish, some expressions of Islam in American context. The New Age, which is sort of an American expression of Hinduism to a degree. Even in our kind of very highly marketed Buddhism, Buddhism in America is marketed in a way like, if you think about it, if you ever go to the health food store and you kind of see those Buddhist magazines, think about, would the Buddha be all that impressed with articles about how you realize financial success through what's the word, being present in the moment, through right mindfulness, the mindfulness exercises in order to achieve business success. That's a sort of Gnostic approach in an odd sort of way. Buddhism by nature has a Gnostic element, because Buddhism says that stuff is illusion, that all of this world is an illusion, and you're trying to overcome that through achieving this sort of mental state. This mental is a bad word, but I lack a better one right now. This state of kind of realization. When the Buddha is talking about self-realization, I don't think he means what most Americans mean, and we need to realize that. So I think that's what Bloom is looking at when he looks at the Gnostic elements of American religion. It, in some sense, is a very American Gnosticism. So we'll get into that more in the weeks ahead. For this week, there's several things to read. One is an article on why liberal churches are dying from the Washington Post. That is for definitional purposes, because Bloom will talk about liberal and conservative churches. He'll claim that he's not making political connections, but there are political connections, and he does kind of veil them and make them. But in his most basic definition, and what I would say, even in religious discussion, when we talk about liberal and conservative, while there may be some overlap with politics of those terms, they're not usually the same thing. We want to talk about them as not as political denotations, but as something very specifically religious. So that the definitional aspects of that article are what really are important. There are also questions about the articles on Gnosticism and Orphism, which I have linked. There are questions. We're going to read Bloom's Invocation and his first 2 chapters of the book this week. And there's a set of questions for all those readings. There'll be a quiz on those set of questions. And also, we're going to start the discussion board hopefully earlier this week. So really, it's going to stretch over 2 weeks. We're going to stretch this discussion out, but try to jump into this discussion as early as you can. As soon as you've done some of the reading that applies to this question of Gnosticism, as soon as you're engaged with what Bloom has written, if you've read like the first chapter, there may be some things that you can say. Go ahead and jump in so that we can have a really good and deeper, and let the conversation go a little longer. The difficulty of a course like this is the discussion has to take place online, and people come to it when they have time. So a discussion that in a class setting would take place over an hour takes place over days. So the more we can get in the front end of that, the front end of the week, the better, so that we have more time to engage with each other on these ideas. There again, so we're looking a lot at Gnosticism, Bloom's idea of Gnosticism, some of the problems with Bloom's idea of Gnosticism, and how it impacts American religion, as well as, I would argue, in some ways, a not always historical approach, and maybe sometimes he tends to cheat in his arguments a little bit. Well, you'll see more. I'll talk more about that in my concluding lecture. But we'll spend a good bit of time. There's a good number of readings, a couple of chapters from Bloom and some other things. But let's get into the discussion board early this week.